On today's Locked On Bucks, we continue to tackle your mailbag questions. The decline of the Bucks, the play from Andre Jackson Jr., and would you take one former Buck in his place? We get into all of those thoughts and more coming up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined once again by Camille Davis and Frank Madden. We thank you for making this your first listen of the day and for checking out the Locked On Bucks newsletter. Sign up for free if you have not done so yet at lockedondaily.com and start your day with the all-new and free Locked On Bucks newsletter. Without further ado, as I mentioned, a lot of questions pouring in from you guys about your Milwaukee Bucks. We continue to tackle those coming up after this. Part number 2 of this Bucks mailbag, and I mentioned we got quite a few questions here. A lot of the same buckets that they seem to fall under. So one of the other more popular ones is some of the names we have mentioned. It ties back to this with guys like Kevin Porter Jr. and Jericho Sims. We haven't gotten to Kyle Kuzma yet, but there was a lot of questions that came in about Khris Middleton and that trade as a whole. I think the most interesting one was, or one of the most interesting ones, was this one. John Horst's reasoning behind trading Khris Middleton, and if you were in his spot, would you be able to do that same trade knowing, look, some of the things that have become evident here with Khris and his physical ability at this point, and just the notion of one of the greatest players in franchise history, who had he stayed here long-term, he's probably going to finish number 2 behind Giannis in just about every category. And you're moving on from him. I don't mean this in a bad way, for Kyle Kuzma.
I mean, so just to repeat the question, if I was John Horst, would I have made the move?
Yes.
That's hard for me to put myself in that man's shoes. I know the way I felt when I saw that the trade went through. So, I mean, Horst has talked about how difficult it was for him to make that decision as well. But as more time goes on, I can understand it. I think for me, I still would have probably gave this squad at least one chance to really go after it together, since health has been detrimental and they weren't able to even hit the court healthy together in the playoffs yet. And then if in the offseason it didn't work, blow it up. But the counter to that is, which was the argument a lot of people who were saying trade Khris Middleton years before, is like, what will the value be at that point if at this trade deadline the return is Kyle Kuzma for, you know, Khris and AJ Johnson plus a pick swap? Like, do you get a player at Kuz's level come summertime if you do wait to that point? And that's probably the risk that I would have taken. So I might have made the wrong choice by waiting, but we would have to see how it shook out.
Yeah, I mean, look, I get it. You can't be overly nostalgic about, these types of decisions, but nostalgia, I think also, I mean, the flip side of that is like the value of it is that it kind of hints at the fact that you know something, you've seen good things from a player or set of players and you've seen it work, right? And so then the question is like, are you just anchoring on something, that a reality that doesn't exist anymore? Or are you, looking at something that actually like very well could happen, or, could resurface again? And I think with Khris, I mean, the obvious counter argument would be like, so why can't he become the guy that we saw, in the playoffs last spring, and get to even 90% of that level, right? I thought he held up defensively in that series. Obviously the offense, was, pretty extraordinary, especially in a few of those games. And, if he's anything like that guy, then I think that guy clearly is more valuable than Kyle Kuzma, right? Who has never been good in the playoffs, even when he was in LA, has never been efficient, even when he was in LA. I don't think he has a game that like scales down and, like he becomes super efficient when he's just cutting off ball and taking open threes and stuff like that. Like that's stuff we just really haven't seen that. So it's not to say that he can't bring, dimensions that I think are important and can't be helpful. But I think, the way I just have sort of perceived this trade. I think I said it, Camille, when we talked about it the day of. I think, even after John Horst comments, like it just feels like a trade that kind of happened because, ownership said, you know what, like Khris hasn't played enough. He's owed a ton of money this year. He's owed a ton of money next year. There are valid reasons, and there are basketball reasons, not just financial reasons to get under the second apron, but there are also financial reasons to get under the second apron, which if your ownership, like, yeah, they're going to consider that. So it kind of just felt like, you know what, we think it's time to move on, and what's the best we can do and get under the second apron. And that kind of happened to be Kyle Kuzma. And I have a hard time wrapping my mind around like the idea that, Kyle Kuzma was the guy that they targeted as like absolutely being the guy that will unlock this team and make them a contender. And it just so happened to require Khris Middleton to make that trade happen. I think it's interesting to ask the question of, would there have been other configurations? Like how much did the Wizards really want Kyle Kuzma Khris Middleton, given he doesn't fit their timeline and he's really just a, like, I guess rehab his value and then hope you can get positive stuff from the summer, which I don't know. Maybe that'll work. I hope it works because I want to see Khris not playing for the Washington Wizards next year. So I don't know. I mean, I think for me, not caring about the Bucks owners' finances, and while I appreciate being a cap nerd, while I appreciate the value of being under the second apron and the potential pick freezing issues that would have come about for the 2032 pick and some of those things, I just don't think I would have been able to do that. I like you said, Camille, like we literally haven't seen this group, that pairing, right? Giannis and Khris, you've mentioned it, like they haven't lost a playoff series together when healthy since 2019, I guess. And it's crazy to think, and that's just kind of how it goes. So I would have liked to at least see, even if that meant Khris being just kind of an overpriced second unit, kind of six-man guy. I think, again, like we have proof of concept of why he works really well with Giannis, even if it's 25 to 30 minutes rather than more. But I don't know. We'll see. I mean, how much of that was health concerns? Again, the team knows that better than we do. So to the extent that was really the concern, then that obviously like makes me give them the benefit of the doubt a little bit more. But ask me on this podcast, could I have traded Khris Middleton for Kyle Kuzma? Man, I don't think I could have done that. And there again, like I was fine trading Drew for Dame because I think it was a swing and it gave you a guy that was clearly better than Drew. And, you'd seen issues with Drew and just the offense just always fell out when the playoffs came. But kind of been the opposite with Khris. Khris has been the one guy who has been reliable in the playoffs these last couple of years. So yeah, it's tough. But, again, I kind of just resigned to the fact that it seemed to be happening one way or another.
Yeah, it's a tough one, but the proof of concept point is valid, but it's also, I mean, what's the definition of insanity, right? That we're talking about. Well, just give this group one chance to be whole. The fact that it's going on this long that we're talking about, I don't know how much you could firmly believe this year is going to be the year. And I think that's a lot of what they're up against. Frank, your point too of, I mean, this doesn't impact us. But I'm sure part of it, it's not just the second apron part. Like in a basketball sense, that is important for the team. So like that's a completely separate conversation than the other one that fans will tend to go to in the luxury tax dollars. But that's a relevant conversation too when you look at the way business is conducted, that the Bucks went from the third highest luxury tax bill down to sixth, from like $70+ million to 29, which, look, the fact that the team was willing to be that deep into the tax and got first round exits 2 straight years out of it says something. At some point, you're going to pull back a little bit. So yeah, in a vacuum to say trading Khris Middleton for Kyle Kuzma, I mean, I think any Bucks fan is going to say, no, I'm good there. But it's just everything that came together with the deal, the spot you put yourself in this summer potentially, and even Kyle Kuzma's contract is something to keep in mind too. But unfortunately, the reality is like And it's why you need that type of mentality and can't be attached. And John Horst clearly struggled with that. Talking about this trade, at least, is the Bucks probably made this move a year too late in all reality with Khris Middleton. So that's always going to be the toughest part. And I mean, it's going to be especially tough Friday when I assume Khris Middleton makes his Washington Wizards debut against the Bucks. So
so weird.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting day on Friday. We had quite a few other questions that came in about another one of the more tenured Bucks players. We'll get into that conversation coming up after this. This next segment of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Prize Picks. As football season may be over, but the basketball action is just heating up, and there is no better way to get in on the excitement than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. It's simple. Just pick more or less on at least 2 player projections. And if you're right, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. With Prize Picks, you control the action all season long. You may be looking at Giannis scoring more than 29 points in a game, or Anthony Edwards scoring more than 25. One thing to love about Prize Picks is how quick and easy it is to make those picks. It takes less than 60 seconds to set your lineup. Plus, their fast and secure withdrawals mean you get paid in as little as 15 minutes when you win. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 off instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That is code LOCKEDONNBA for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. So the other name that carried a lot of questions, and surprisingly, Camille, as you put together this list, I was very surprised to see an absence of Bobby Portis related questions, but instead we saw quite a few that centered around Brook Lopez and the perceived decline that a lot of Bucks fans have said he is experiencing. I mean, I guess right off the bat, I'm just going to say, has he declined? Sure. Like, that's natural. Everybody does. I don't think it's to the levels that some Bucks fans are certain that it's at, but just his piece and the overall state of the team. I thought this was one of the more interesting questions that we got from Elisa on YouTube. What's mainly responsible for the team's decline in your eyes? Yes, they have declined. Under Bud, it seemed it didn't really matter who was on the team. We got a lot of wins. So what has changed?
I mean, the first thing you point to is health of this team. And I think you also need to just look around the landscape of the league. I think that more teams are more talented in the league right now. Yeah, just like it's just greater competition throughout the league. So you're not going to be able to run over as many teams as you did before. Like the Eastern Conference gets a lot of slack. You know, they've been the laughing stock for years in the Eastern Conference, but the top of the East is good. And those other teams that are competing, you know, for that playoff play-in spot, they're going to give you a run for your money. There just aren't as many tanking teams. So I think it's a combination of health affecting the Bucks along the way. Of course, there was all of last season and just the integration of a new star player to the team and figuring out how that flow works. So while you're learning how to adjust to playing with a different player, you're going to take some lumps along the way as well. And then on top of that too, just the comp around the league has gotten better.
Are we talking about, so do you want us to focus on Brook Lopez or just the more general?
Well, I mean, if you have specific thoughts on Brook Lopez, but this was the team overall.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I don't think Bud's style, you could just rinse and repeat your way to like 55 wins in today's day and age. I think stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's working for the Suns, Frank.
Yeah, I know. Seriously, right? I mean, like, you know, I think Bud and the style that they brought and the system they had, you know, from the start of the 2018 season on really through his last season, right? I mean, they won 58 games. And part of that was by evolving a little bit, by being a little bit more like, hey, we're going to, you know, not overhelp as much. Yeah, we're going to actually try to, you know, let Brook and Giannis like be big boys and like kind of handle stuff and not collapse everything to stop penetration all the time. So I think, you know, some of it is just kind of, obviously, like there's an aging out of some players, right? I mean, like Pat Connaughton, obviously, you look at the guys that were here, right? I think Pat obviously has declined. I will say, I think he's done a good job of just kind of like staying ready. Like, I don't think the bottom has
Yeah.
fallen off, you know, like when he's actually gotten opportunities, like
I think he's been perfectly fine. Yeah.
it's the
And
3-point
this is the
percentage hasn't
role,
been there. The
and
3-point
this is the
percentage
role
hasn't
he
been
should
there,
have played
but
last year too. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, but they didn't have a chance. They didn't have the
Right.
opportunity for him to be in that role. They needed him last year. They didn't have as many options
Yeah.
last year as they do this year.
Yeah. And I think, like, you know, with Brook in particular, I think, I mean, it's sort of a sense that you look at like a lot of the numbers, right? I mean, I think like the advanced numbers say there's been like some decline, right? Like
Yeah.
in terms of like his EPM stuff is gone down a little bit from last year to this year. I mean, 2 years ago was really kind of the high water mark, right? In the 58 win season is, you know, second in DPOI. So that was really kind of the peak of things. But it's like kind of you look at it too. I mean, he's still shooting like 36, 37% from three. His 2-point percentage, I think, is slightly higher this year, I want to say. I think honestly, like I think defensively, of course, he's not getting like quicker, right? And I think, you know, I think part of it, honestly, like and I think we saw a little bit with Khris and some of that, right? Like there's going to be like the crowd that like the trade that guy crowd, right? Like the people who don't like think about, okay, well, what could you get for this player? How does trading a guy like actually help you as a team? How would you replace him? What kind of player would you, you know, fill his spot with? You know, I think Brook and Khris have been sort of like the classic guys that people are like, hey, I got to move that guy, you know, whatever. And, you know, then it's like, oh, you got to move him. It's like, okay, guys, well, you got Kyle Kuzma for Khris Middleton, you know, that's what you got. So like people who complained about Khris before, like you're not allowed to complain because they got Kyle Kuzma, right? Like, because that was the market, you know, and it is what it is. And maybe they'll end up being a little bit better for it this year because there's some dynamic which we can talk about that Kuzma brings that Khris couldn't. They're obviously very different players. Kyle has his positives. And I think with Brook, it's kind of the same thing that, you know, like, I mean, I would say this as somebody who's like over the years, like obviously been a huge Brook fan, quote unquote, defender of Brook. I mean, he shouldn't be playing 32 minutes a game. He shouldn't be playing more now than he ever has, you know, as a Buck. Like there's a dependency there, and that I think is not particularly healthy for him or the team. And that's obviously why we've often sort of gone back on this idea of like, oh, they got to figure out how to unlock those small lineups a little bit more. But I don't know. I mean, if Brook missed a couple weeks the way Bobby did, and we saw what happened to the team's rim protection without him, like maybe then people would like not complain about Brook Lopez. Of all the things to complain about, like with Brook, like, you know, the fact that like he doesn't block every single shot, you know, is like kind of like just makes me, you know, kind of shake my head a little bit. Like, yeah, I mean, he can't do everything. And I think, you know, his kind of the way he's a box out guy, right? Like every year the team defensive rebounds better with him on the floor, but it's not because he goes out and grabs like all the rebounds himself. And so I think like when you lose Giannis or you lose Bobby, I think you do see like issues crop up because like when those small guys can't go off and get the ball, then they do look a lot more fragile, certainly on defense and as a rebounding team. So yeah, I mean, I think there's still absolutely a role for Brook, but would it be better at like 25 minutes per game rather than 32? Like, yeah, I think so. And the problem is then like, how do you, like, who's taking those extra 7 minutes, which may not seem like a lot, and maybe some of it's Bobby, but
well, clearly,
you know,
Jericho Sims.
Jericho Sims. It's the Jericho Sims solution, because he's more athletic, so therefore he's better. Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, again, like, and this is why I think, you know, the idea of re-signing Brook is like that you get him for less money than you're paying him now, and so, you know, I would hope, and it only takes one team, but I would hope that you could probably get Brook back for, you know, the mid-level
basically
this summer. And if you can, then like I would say that's kind of a no-brainer, because that's the thing. Like, well, who can kind of space the floor around Giannis, give Giannis room to operate, but also be like that big body that protects the rim behind Giannis, because we know that, and we saw it, right? Giannis struggles in that role, to be the only kind of big guy when other teams are playing like kind of normal size.
Yeah,
it's a really short list. Like there are very few guys that do that, and most of the guys that do that are like, you know, Kristaps Porzingis, you know, or like Wemby. You know, it's like guys that are not like in the discussion that the Bucks could really target. So yeah, it's really hard. And I'm, you know, again, like, could Giannis work with like just a rim rolling big man? Like maybe it could work a bit, right? I mean, I think that's sort of the sneaky thing. Like the Brook on off stats, the Bucks are 7 points per 100 better defensively with them this year. So again, you think the Bucks aren't good defensively with Brook on the floor? Go look at what they do when he's off the floor, right? Like Giannis cannot paper over when Brook is off the floor, and it's been true really for a couple years now. And so really the issue has been the offensive end, right? And I think part of the issue, I thought, Brook's sort of screening for Dame, setting like the fact that he can actually set like better screens and, put Dame one-on-one with bigs was kind of a strength. But I think what we've seen is Brook, I think, is implicitly kind of part of the issue with this double teaming and trapping that we see teams do, because as much as like a center guarding Brook is not suited to defend Dame one-on-one, you can trap. And then the problem is if Brook is your outlet, your release valve, Brook's a glacier. Like he's not like attacking the defense typically and making plays and some of that other stuff. So I think that's kind of one of those things the Bucks have not solved, is like, how do you kind of play offense even with Brook's spacing? How do you, and his touch and all the stuff he can do from a skill standpoint? I think his screening has not unlocked Dame in the way that I certainly would have hoped it. And I think you kind of have to give credit to other teams because they've realized it and they've just sort of like put tons of pressure on Dame.
Yeah, and I think Miles Turner is the name that gets mentioned too. The Bucks fans have like, well, just sign Miles Turner in the offseason. I mean, we're talking about retaining hopefully Brook Lopez for around the mid-level versus the money it's going to cost to bring in Miles Turner. I think if that's the case, I don't think Giannis and Dame are on the team with this configuration, not both of those guys, with the way that we've seen the league move. So it's going to be a conversation that we have again in the summer when I think the Bucks try hard and probably extend Brook Lopez for 2 more years, that we're going to come right back to because a big part of it too is just the age, and that, there's been this, hey, you got to get younger. And people look at the age and say, well, he's 36 going on 37. You have to find somebody younger here. So I think that's a big piece of it too. The last point, look, Miles Turner's a great player, but he's going to command a lot of money, and he's not the rim protector that Brook Lopez is. I mean, sure, he's good, but the numbers have gradually decreased year over year over year, where he's basically just a stretch big at this point. So there's no clear answer out there. I mean, it's just like, if you're selling your house, where are you going to move to? Well, who cares? I made a lot of money. Well, it's going to be a problem when you're looking for homes. That's where the Bucks are kind of at with replacing Brook. Just trade him. What's plan B? Like, you kind of need to know what that is. A few more to get to.
And one other thing to note there too, maybe the week off, honestly, like Brook's a guy who just plays every night. Like I kind of hope, like, the last few weeks, like him looking a little bit less spry, like a half step slow. Yeah. I mean, he's kind of a guy I think you look at, even though he theoretically is healthy. He's a guy that certainly could benefit at his age from just getting some time off and just kind of resting his body and coming back hopefully a little bit fresher. So anyway, glass half full.
One more break here, or we'll take another break and get to a few more questions coming up after this. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is watching TurboTax experts do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives you your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, and everything up to 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed. Now waiting, wondering, no worries. Now this is taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Okay, so that was the Brook Lopez and the Bucks' current state of affairs type of talk. One other interesting one that I know you will have some thoughts on, Frank, that I wanted to get to from Jay on Twitter, who asks bluntly, do you really believe in Andre Jackson Jr. as a defensive stopper?
Frank, he said you up first.
Well, I would say this in general, right? I mean, I think I've been kind of the like resident, bearish guy on.
I think I've been there as much as I can with my role with the team, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I don't think Andre's shown enough defensively. I don't think the impact, I don't think there's like a measurable enough impact for like from what we've seen from Andre to justify like continuing to start him, especially with Kuzma coming in. I think, that's one for me, like one kind of positive of like Kuzma coming in is that I think it makes it like all the more imperative that you go back to either Gary Trent or AJ Green as the starting two guard. And again, like I think you're going to have a problem getting enough shots for everybody in the starting five because everybody in the starting five, I think, needs some shots, which obviously Andre did not. But I think you just look at the numbers. Like the starting five isn't good. They haven't been good all year. This isn't a new phenomenon. They're bad offensively. They're mediocre defensively. They get outscored. They've been getting outscored all year long. Andre's numbers have really gone south in terms of like he had really good on-off numbers early in the year. They're now, I think, some of the worst numbers. I think they might be the worst numbers among the kind of like rotation guys. And honestly, like it kind of makes sense because like the more he's kind of gotten a profile and the more he's gotten on the scouting report, and I think using him as a starter also just shines a light on the fact that like, okay, what are we gonna do when we start the game? Well, they have a guy who doesn't want to shoot, and even like from the dunker spot doesn't want to shoot.
Yeah.
And so I think that has like I think that's hurt Andre. I know when I've said this before, people have said like, oh, is it gonna like hurt his confidence? And to me, it's like I don't think it's helping his confidence the fact that, teams come out with a game plan not to defend him, right?
Yeah.
So I think putting him in, and he's not playing a ton of minutes already, right? So it just seems like very performative because they turned around the season after 2-8 by putting him in the starting five. It seems like they're just sort of stuck. Like, oh, we gotta trot out the starting five, right? We tried the Middleton thing for a little bit. So I think like and I've made the case why Kuzma would make more sense as a 6-man, but if Kuzma's starting, like I don't know why you would play him, who obviously his 3-point shooting is very inconsistent, and Andre. I think you go back to one of those kind of more stretch shooters at the 2 spot, and you can still bring on Andre off the bench to match up, with opposing scorers in kind of non-starter portions of the game. But like if you don't believe that he's not closing games, so if Doc doesn't trust him to close games, then why are we still continuing to see him start games as well? I don't think it helps him. I don't think it helps the team. And again, I think he's made strides in terms of like trying to do more stuff offensively. His 3-point shooting has been remarkably consistent, but like also his passing decision making is still pretty poor. So I think he still needs work and reps. But I would just much rather see it kind of come off the bench. And again, I just don't think. I think also just a lot of nights that there's just not like an obvious guy that he needs to go and do his full court kind of harassment of. So again, not to bury Andre or something, but I just think we have enough data now, and especially with the Kuzma deal, I think it sort of highlights that a change makes sense.
Whenever we would hear going back to, this turnaround started with Andre, like, yeah, I mean, it lined up with him being in the starting lineup, but we're overlooking the fact that guys started hitting shots and guys started playing better. So that's the biggest part I've always struggled with. And one of the other things, like I think we've constantly pointed out the numbers of the groupings with Andre on the floor and everything else in what you just said, Frank, of why by the numbers this is a stretch at best, but may not work. The other thing that I've just kind of struggled with and thinking, I don't know that this works, is the sheer fact that I think Andre is better suited to defend threes and potentially fours than guys in the backcourt, because it's those types of matchups that seemingly give him the most problems. Like it's been Gary Trent Jr. that's held up better on those type of smaller, quicker players, and it's been Andre Jackson Jr.
He has the potential there. Like we've seen it. That's why everybody was clamoring for him to get on the court in the first place, of what he can do defensively. I think he has taken some strides defensively this year, like the foul rate going down for him. But is his defense so critical to the team that you can
it elite?
Can you overlook the offensive part based on what he's bringing to you defensively? When you look at somebody like an Amen Thompson in Houston, where you're like, well, the offense he needs to come along a bit more, but everything else that he's doing is like, we have to keep him on the court. And I don't think Andre's there. And that's not to compare him and say he's going to be a bad player, but he is someone who I think this upcoming summer is going to be really big for him and continuing his growth, because as we've seen through this season offensively, he's getting a little bit more confident. Anyone who's ever hooped, or at the very least, you've been to a park when people are playing pickup ball, you know, one of the most embarrassing things to hear is self-guard or he with us. Like those types of things when
Non-shooter.
Right. And you're just sitting there and you're opening, you like, like, what am I supposed to do? So to see Andre, like the last game before the break, I think he took like 5 or 6 attempts from the field.
Just only 1-3, I think.
Yeah, like just keep, it has to keep growing for him, because if he can provide that offensively, it opens up to keep him on the court more for the defense in situations where it's required. So I think that there's still a lot of potential that could be tapped with Andre. But we're just going to have to start seeing some fruits of it. I would say next season more than anything else.
Yeah, it's not to say you give up on him, but
right.
You just, for where you're at and what your expectations are,
right
you need
now.
something else. Yeah, the last thing on this before we take a break here. Because you mentioned it too, Camille, like if you're going to be a one-way player, you got to be elite at that end. Would you rather have Andre right now? Would you rather have Andre Jackson Jr. or Malik Beasley?
Ooh, I'd probably still go with Andre, just given the fact that you have a Gary Trent Jr. You have some other guys who can put the ball in the hoop. Gary Trent Jr. being on the team helps me ease that part of it, but like I think I would still go that route with Ajax over Bees.
Frank?
Yeah, I mean Beasley's obviously been a much better player this year than him. I mean Beasley has been certainly more productive than AJ and Gary Trent, right? I think I would certainly put like, you know, AJ's defense and probably Gary's defense. You know, I haven't watched Malik obviously this year, but assuming it was kind of like what it was like last year, defensively, you know, up against that. So it would be strange to have like 3 guys who are like literally all trying to do the same things. Like how you kind of get all those guys minutes would be somewhat challenging. So I think it's been worth like trying to see what you have with Andre and seeing if maybe you catch lightning in a bottle here. And he's just like so game changing defensively. And, you know, he's one of the few guys that actually tries to get offensive rebounds, which kind of makes sense that he would sort of do the Energizer Bunny thing there. But yeah, it just hasn't worked. And, you know, I think probably the biggest issue has been like, he kind of came with this reputation of being this kind of like high IQ offensive player and playmaker. And I mean, I think we remember talking about this, like going to the Adrian Griffin training camp before they signed campaign. It was like, were they thinking Andre Jackson was going to be the backup point guard ish sort of guy, which now like just seems crazy because his decision making is so I'll call it inconsistent, right? Like just the number of times he like speed dribbles up the floor and then like makes a terrible pass that gets picked off, and just some of this stuff. I mean, it's and again, never mind the fact that like, can you imagine him trying to run a pick and roll? Like if you don't ever want to shoot a jumper or a layup, like you can't run a pick and roll. There's no point, right? Like why would anybody take you seriously? So, yeah, I think that's probably been the biggest sort of disappointment for me is like, honestly, like the 3-point shooting has been probably his most consistent thing that he's done well on offense.
Surprisingly.
Like, it's crazy, right? If you had told us that he was going to be a 38% 3-point shooter both years, we would be like, oh my God, like this guy like has a chance to like be a real like diamond in the rough. But yeah, it's been hard. Only other thing I'll say, Justin, I think he may be better off guarding smaller players because I do think he's a really good screen navigator. He's really good at kind of getting skinny and moving laterally. And like, I feel like Gary in particular, like just gets, especially because Gary's like a gambler too. And he just like, Gary sometimes just like ends up in the wrong zip code, which kind of gives me pause as like being like the guy who's going to be like defending the best player, you know, in the playoffs. Like that definitely gives me some concerns. So yeah, I mean, there's no perfect answer here because, you know, again, like there's no single player who does all the things well enough for the Bucks, but we'll see. And like I said, that's why I don't want to see, you know, Ajax just get buried on the bench and not play anymore.
Right.
Interesting thought there. One other thing to get to, Camille and I will tackle that one coming up after this on Locked On Bucks. All right, Camille, one final question to get to. This wasn't a part of the mailbag. We still got a ton of questions on the mailbag. We're going to save for down the road in this season yet. But we had our discussion about All-Star on Monday's show. Giannis's comments. We both kind of shared How do you fix this? And how do we make the All-Star experience better, the game itself, an All-Star weekend? I'd be lying if I didn't say it. I went back to what Giannis said. At first, I thought, whatever. And then you read it again, like, I don't know, maybe, where it's the full-on USA versus the world. And it's a rotating event that's not, going between NBA cities. But one year it's hosted by an NBA team. The next year it's played in China, or the next year it's played somewhere in Europe. And that's where you rotate it.
It could be interesting seeing that way. And I think seeing what the NHL did this year for their Four Nations tournament in place of their All-Star game, and seeing just the different countries representing each other and playing against each other, the competition level that came with that. We've heard from international players before. Wemby is one of them who said it before. I think Jokic as well, of like, listen, Olympic gold means more to me than an NBA championship would, because of what it represents. We've heard of Giannis talking about why it's so important for him to represent Greece in the Olympics and what it means to represent your country. And we've also seen on the other side, like the competition around us is getting better around the world, but we still feel as if we are those guys. Like, this is our sport. Like, we're not getting off the square. So I do think if you can capture that competition with having it world versus USA, and then also add in that aspect of the traveling of it all, and you having different fan bases for Team USA to feel like they're on the road some of those years for the other team. Like, I think it could be a fun addition to the festivities.
So would Team USA, would they also get Canada as the 51st state, or?
I don't think Canada would want to be like that's the 51st state.
Yeah, I think it would be Canada against Team USA going very hard there. But yeah, as I mentioned, we have a ton of questions that came in from you guys with a lot of thoughts. We didn't really mention much of Kyle Kuzma. There wasn't a ton of Kyle Kuzma. I mean, leave it to Bucks fans. We got more questions about Jericho Sims than we did Kyle Kuzma, but still a ton of these to get to. So thanks to everybody that dropped us a question, whether it be in the YouTube comments, on Twitter, on Blue Sky, the email address as well. We're going to have to do another mailbag episode. I know we already stretched out 2 here with Frank, but we're going to do another one at some point in the second half, post All-Star break schedule here, getting back to some of the questions we haven't gotten to, and also new ones. So continue to leave your questions. We'll keep compiling those for the mailbag. That'll come up in a couple of weeks here later on in the season. But that'll do it for this marathon recording session of your mailbag questions. Our thanks to Frank for his time, to all of you guys for the questions that you provided us as well. For Camille, I'm Justin. We will talk with you guys once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.